On the subject, we're talking about U.S. funding of the Lebanese army. David Schenker and Aram Naraguzian, they're not just scholars of this topic, they have in fact shaped U.S. policy on this issue. So it's a real honor to have them with us today to lend their insight into this very unique topic. And I'm really glad we're having this talk. I was a long-time Beirut resident. I lived there from 2000 to 2009. And as such, I like many Lebanese, developed a very, very strong feeling toward the Lebanese army, which was most of the time a very, very comforting presence in my life, sometimes a somewhat absent presence in my life, depending on the situation. But I'll never forget the week that the Syrians withdrew from Lebanon in 2005, and they abandoned major checkpoints in places like the Bekaa Valley, and the Lebanese army moved in and took their place. And I remember Lebanese citizens driving past the army and yelling out, "Ahlan, marhaba ya watan," hello, the nation. And finally, the Lebanese nation had arrived, and we all felt very proud and very hopeful. And it was at that time that the Bush administration saw a new role for Lebanon's army. Of course, there'd also been an election of a pro-Western government. And the Bush team saw a new role for the army. It was clear that it was one of the few institutions that had support from a wide variety of society. And, hello, Andrew. The army was seen as a potentially stabilizing and unifying force. But then, of course, this period was followed by a very insecure period of assassinations and bombings, and then an uprising in a Palestinian camp in the north in Nahr al-Bared. And it became clear that this army was extremely undermanned, under-equipped, and underfunded. And that's when the Bush administration, began authorizing funding of the army, which I gather has amounted to about $500 million to this day. Fast forward to today, 2010, slightly different situation. March 14th still heads Lebanon's government, but Hezbollah is playing a stronger role in the government. Syria is regaining influence in the country, and now there are new questions about the funding of Lebanon's army. To what extent should it be funded? What kind of materiel should it receive? What can we expect of this army in this new environment? Aram Naraguzian, who'll be speaking first, is a resident scholar at CSIS, where he conducts research on the Middle East and North Africa. More importantly, he's a former MEI intern. So, you interns out there, this is what you can become. For better. His research at CSIS focuses on security politics in the Levant and the Gulf. He's the author of the Lebanese Armed Forces, Challenges and Opportunities in Post-Syria Lebanon, which CSIS is putting out shortly. It's coming out in this summer. He's also a lecturer of security studies at Saint Joseph University in Beirut, Lebanon. I should note that Aram gets invited to Lebanon to lecture the Lebanese army about itself. So that's how much he knows. David Schenker is the Afusian Fellow and Director of the Program on Air Politics at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Previously, he served in the office of the Secretary of Defense as Levant Country Director, the Pentagon's top policy aide on the Arab countries of the Levant. In that capacity, he was responsible for advising the Secretary and other senior Pentagon officials on the military and political affairs of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories. Thank you both very much for joining us. Before we begin, I want to note that today's talk is part of a Lebanon policy series. We've got several more talks coming up. Our next one is April 27th, and is featuring Andrew Tabler, who's here with us today, of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and Mona Yacoubian of USIP. They'll be talking about the evolving Lebanese-Syrian relationship, and Ted Coutu, former U.S. ambassador to Syria, will be moderating. And then in May, we have Paul Salem of Carnegie's Beirut Center, joined by Samir Daher, formerly of the World Bank, talking about political and economic reform in Lebanon. And then in June, we're having a talk on the Salafi jihadi threat in Lebanon. So I hope you can all join us for these talks. The only other thing I want to add is that each speaker is talking for about 20 minutes, and then that'll be followed by a Q&A. Normally we go till 1 o'clock, but because we've got two speakers, we're going till 1:15 today, so that'll give us lots of time for a Q&A. Now, please join me in welcoming Aram, who's going to be starting. Thank you. And you've got some water there.
Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who know my briefings, they tend to be 120 slides. We've actually managed to bring it down to about 24, 25. Prime Minister Hariri survived a 90-slide PowerPoint, so I hope you'll survive this one. I am going to skip through a lot of the details of security assistance in terms of the hardware. I'm hoping to leave that for any Q&A you guys might have. I figured that the details are always more interesting in a discussion forum context anyway, and better to leave the broader lines of security assistance to the PowerPoint. And the agenda is pretty straightforward. I'll go quickly through U.S. military assistance to Lebanon as a pattern of funding. I'll talk about the paradoxes of military development in a post-war divided society like Lebanon, and then try to go through the pros and cons of U.S. assistance with some closing remarks. It's often forgotten that U.S. strategic imperatives in the region dictate where Lebanon fits in overall U.S. policy. And policy towards Lebanon has been dictated for the last 60 years by conservative strategic imperatives dictated by Gulf security, access to waterways, access to natural resources, and maintaining relative stability in the Middle East. The security of Israel is also the paramount concern of the United States in the Levant. Today, the trend dictates that Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, or AfPak, as we like to call it now, the Burke chair in Washington, it seems as well, also dominate especially the post 9/11 context on the U.S. posture towards the Levant and the region. A brief overview of just Middle East energy infrastructure. We won't linger on it, but it's important to bear in mind that when U.S. policy focuses in on Lebanon, it is within a broader regional context that has to do with the flow of natural resources in the world economy, maintaining that flow of resources, and maintaining predictability in a changing economy. This gives you an indication of the overall pattern of assistance. The yellow graph is for economic support funding. You have numbers for 2010, 2011. These are projected estimates. They're subject to change depending on congressional justifications, depending on evolving security needs in Lebanon and the region. You can see the spike of FMF funding starting in 2007. To give you a better sense of what the funding looks like, we can see it separate from ESF funding. Lebanon has been earmarked $525 million in U.S. security assistance, and that number is growing if you factor in 2010 numbers and future 2011 allocations. It is a significant boost in assistance, to say the least. It's important to note, and I can address this during the Q&A, that military assistance has mainly been about the nuts and bolts of military development, really picking up where the last effort to build up the LAF in the post-Ta'if context in 1990, 1992 left off, which is to say basic mobility, parts, training, basic gear, a lot of the nuts and bolts of any military's basic needs. It's also important to bear in mind that U.S. assistance, while starting on a given year, for example, 2006, does not bear fruit within that given fiscal year. It's important to see that FMF, the FMS process, and what are known as the pseudo-FMS cases, the pseudo-foreign military sales cases, all follow different guidelines, but the predominant path is one whereby security assistance